Welcome to our first How Did We Get Here educational program. This program is sponsored and presented by the High Point Historical Society and the High Point Museum. In today's day and time, we are together via a Zoom meeting. Our goal is to have these programs in the High Point Museum Lecture Hall once the museum opens back up and it's safe to be together again. But we are very thankful for today's technology and what it has to offer. Thank you all for participating. How Did We Get Here educational experience takes a current topic, explores it through the progression in time, and how it might tie to our High Point history. Today's topic, the 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage. High Point Museum Director Edith Brady and High Point Museum Educational Curator Sara Blanchett will give an overview of the history of the women's suffrage movement and share documents related to High Point suffragists supporting the 19th Amendment around 1920. Thank you, Edith and Sara, for leading this event and our discussion.
Great. All right, well, I am Edith Brady, the museum director, and I'm going to take the first part of this presentation. This was actually the logo that was created this year for the Women's Vote Centennial Commission, and they did all kinds of programming and social media sharing, lots of things this year. Of course, this has been a big celebration, and we've shared some things earlier this summer related to the women's suffrage history as well. But one thing that a lot of people may not realize is how far back the women's suffrage movement actually goes. There's this year a lot of focus on kind of that 1920 period because, of course, that's the end of getting the amendment passed. But in 1848, there was the Seneca Falls Women's Right Convention. It was held in New York, and that was the first women's right convention. And that was when this idea about bringing about women's suffrage was really introduced and put forth as an agenda item for women in this country. And so that was kind of what is typically kind of thought of as sort of the very beginning of this in this country. And then there was some movement and some activity going on in the ensuing years. There were a couple other conventions and different things happening. There was also some work done kind of around trying to secure property rights for women and that sort of thing. But everything got on hold a little bit during the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 because there were other things going on. And so women were turning their attention towards, supporting that war effort and just kind of getting through that conflict. But then shortly after the Civil War, they got right back to it. And then now there was an additional piece because, of course, all the enslaved people were now free. And so there was also a question about citizenship and voting rights related to the Black population in the United States. So in 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the Equal Suffrage Association. And their goal initially was universal suffrage. So they wanted to focus both on women's right to vote as well as the African American right to vote. But that was not always an easy sell with different groups in our country. And so there was a lot of discussion kind of all around that. And in the next kind of big milestone is in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, but as you may remember, the 14th Amendment is about the citizenship of and the rights to vote for African American men. It is not universal suffrage for women. So there was another House resolution put forth for universal suffrage, which would have included women, but it was never taken up. So the 14th Amendment becomes the one that gets introduced first, which is more focused on adding the vote for African American men. In 1869, Stanton and Anthony found the National Women's Suffrage Association. And this is where there's actually split in 1869, and there's a couple things going on. One is that Stanton and Anthony feel like the best way to do this is to get a constitutional amendment at the federal level. That will just cover it, for all the states. There's another group, Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, Julia Ward Howe, who think the better approach is to go through just tackling this at the state level, state by state by state. So just getting all of these individual states to amend their individual constitutions, and then eventually we'll have women's suffrage, but it will be done at the state level instead of at the federal level. So that was the big split there. So they end up in two different camps, campaigning kind of in different ways. So then the next year in 1870, we get the 15th Amendment, which actually, the 14th Amendment creates the citizenship, and then the 15th Amendment gives Black men the right to vote. So that's what the difference between those two are. Sorry, I'm not sure I was clear earlier, but so the 15th Amendment does get passed. In the National Women's Suffrage Association, they really didn't want to support, even though they wanted a constitutional amendment at the federal level, they were really stuck on a universal suffrage amendment. And so as an organization, they say, nope, we're going to fight for all or nothing, because there's concern that if they support the 15th Amendment, then they'll never get support to get another amendment for women. And so they feel like it's all or nothing. Frederick Douglass, who has been part of this group because he wanted to go the route of the federal amendment, he, of course, breaks with them over this issue because, of course, his concern is making sure that that Black citizens get the right to vote, and he's wants to make sure that at least Black men get the right to vote, because that's one step in the right direction. Because right now, of course, no African Americans have the right to vote up to that point. So that's where he splits with them at that point in time. They did, that National Women's Suffrage Association were trying to get a 16th Amendment that would go for universal suffrage to replace what had been put in there for that 15th Amendment, but of course, that didn't really go anywhere at that time. But the 15th Amendment does get passed. So that was, a progression towards universal suffrage in that year. In 1872, since they don't have a universal suffrage amendment, women decide to try to see if they can get away with voting the presidential election, trying to use the 14th Amendment to justify this. It doesn't really work. Susan B. Anthony gets arrested. There are some other women that try to get arrested. Sojourner Truth, who of course was an African-American activist, she tried, but she didn't even get to vote. She got turned away before she could even get a ballot cast. So that really didn't go very far, but it was just evidence that women were still trying to figure out a way to get this done. So in 1878, finally, there is a women's suffrage amendment proposed in the Senate. It doesn't get passed, but the 19th Amendment that gets passed much later actually uses the same wording. So this is the first time that amendment is really introduced in the wording that we know today, was in 1878. And then in 1887 was the first actual Senate vote on women's suffrage, and it was defeated. So we still aren't getting very far at this point. So by 1890, our two groups of women that had split, they come back together, because by this point, they've just got to figure out, they feel like, they've got to be unified to make this happen. And of course, the issue of, 14th, 15th Amendment is behind them now. So they come back together to try to work together to figure out a plan to get women's suffrage passed. Also in 1890, Wyoming is admitted to the Union with a state constitution granting suffrage. So they had already, when they set up their territorial constitution, they had already included women's right to vote then. And so when they come in, they are, the first state really here to have that comes into the Union with women's suffrage as part of it. And that's 1890. All this started in 1848. So it takes a long time to get to this point. So 1896, we have Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Frances E.W. Harper, who found the National Association of Women's Clubs. There's another group that gets started in the same year, and that is the National Association of Colored Women, which was focused on women's suffrage more exclusively. This group, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, did other things, but suffrage was one of the concerns that they had. And 1896 is an interesting year that both of these organizations are getting founded, because if you remember that this is the year of the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision, which is what really cemented segregation and really ushered in that era of Jim Crow, when basically with that separate versus equal clause that came out of that decision, it provided the justification that these states, municipalities, everywhere needed to really put in these segregational practices in a more codified kind of way. So it's interesting that, that is also the same year that they're really creating these organizations. And then in 1912, there is kind of an important milestone that happens here. Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party becomes the first major national party to support women's suffrage. And what you're seeing here, right, by the time you get here to about 1900, you start to see some more significant movement in what's going on. There's several things that are happening. One is that period of kind of 1900, about 1925, that we think of as the progressive era, is you're seeing more and more women coming into expanded roles. You're starting to see them, actually going to college, becoming teachers, getting work in these public arenas outside the home. So they're entering sort of the public sphere a little bit more, and that is kind of increasing sort of the politicization of women and their involvement in things outside of that home group, home and family. So there's more interest, there's more activity going on. The other thing that's happening is during this period of time, those Western states that are coming into the Union are coming in, and even some of the ones that had been here a little bit earlier are starting to pass women's suffrage. So that effort to get that state by state constitutional amendments or get it included in constitutions as they're coming into the Union is successful and happening more and more out in the West. So they're picking up some momentum in those Western states. So by 1913, they're further emboldened by activities of women in England. There is a little bit more radical group over there that had started doing parades and picketing and things like this, that more public sort of protesting in a different way than we had done before in this country. And so inspired by that activity, our National Association of Women's Suffrage Association, which was those two groups that had recombined, they put on the suffragist parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And that was, a really big display. All these women were out in white. It was a very striking image of them, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue there in Washington, D.C. And so that was the beginning of, or one of the first times that they're really out there doing the things that we think of more as social protest kind of thing today. And then Alice Paul, who is a little bit becomes, so what you see is some of the younger women like Alice Paul who are coming along now, they're getting impatient with, how long this is taking and how long this is going on. And they feel like we got to do more. We need more action. So they're like, that parade was a great start, but we need to do more than that. And so she forms a group that comes to be known as the National Women's Party. They actually had a different name for the first couple of years, but it was founded in 1913. And by 1916, it comes to be known as the National Women's Party. And they are very focused on these more, direct action tactics. So in 1916, we get another great milestone. Jeanette Rankin, that should be Rankin, not Ranking, of Montana, becomes the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. And so that's a big milestone. We don't have the right to vote yet. Women don't have the right to vote, but we do have a woman who has been elected. And again, note that she's coming from a Western state where we've made more progress in this area. Woodrow Wilson also announces that the Democratic Party will support women's suffrage. So we're starting to see more and more support at the national level of politics, because I think people are starting to see the momentum is moving this direction. And so these parties realize that, it's probably it's gonna turn eventually. And then in 1917, that National Women's Party, that's Alice Paul's group, they pick at the White House, and that becomes a big thing. They're out there for a long time and very noticeable, drawing a lot of attention. So 1918, Representative Rankin, not Rankin, I got that wrong twice. She opens the debate on the suffrage amendment in the House. And so this is the first time that they're really getting traction in the House. And the amendment does pass the House. They managed to get it passed, but they can't get it passed through the Senate before Congress adjourns. So 1918 ends, and we still haven't got the 19th Amendment passed. But 1919 is the year that everything really, really heats up. So, and that's when the activity here in the High Point area starts heating up as well. Not until this point, but in May of 1919, we finally get a group of women in High Point. This is the first time that we've been able to find that women in High Point are really getting organized. And May 17th of 1919, the Equal Suffrage League is formed here in High Point. And you'll recognize some of these names. Clara Cox, who was, a very progressive woman of this era. She helped found the Women's Club here in High Point. She helped found the YWCA. She was involved in all kinds of different activities, progressive activities here in the city of High Point and around this area, even beyond the city. Mrs. Willis Slane, that's the name we recognize, was the secretary. Miss Mary Alice Tate, who's another High Point, leading family name, was corresponding secretary. Mrs. E.M. Shipman and Mrs. J.E. Kirkman were also members. So there were some leading citizens, here in High Point, families that were involved with this. It does seem to be a fairly small group. We don't have a lot of documentation about them. There are a few, small announcements about their meetings that sort of show up at the club meetings in the Enterprise at the time. But we don't have a lot of documentation about what they were doing, but we do know they were here and active in that spring. And part of the reason they may have gotten organized in that spring is because there is they know this push is coming to try to get that resolution, get suffrage, try again in this congressional session to get that amendment passed. So in May 21st, the House passes Joint Resolution 1, which is the 19th Amendment, using that wording from that original, 1868 first resolution that went through. And then in June 4th, the Senate does finally pass the 19th Amendment. So 1919, June, we've got it passed at the congressional level. But in order to be ratified and to go into effect, throughout the country, we actually need, at that point, based on the number of states we had in the United States at that time, we needed 36 states to ratify this amendment for it to take effect. So, of course, campaigning heated up everywhere for this. But it was really critical in the South because that was where we had so many states, the West, that wasn't an issue out there. They've already got it passed in their state legislatures. There wasn't much controversy there. But it's, when you get down to the South, this is where it was really, there were a lot of very controversial in southern states. So North Carolina is poised to be that by the time the North Carolina legislative session is happening, we only need one more state to ratify for this to go into effect. So it's, a big contentious topic here in North Carolina. In August 17th of 1920, it actually comes to a vote in the North Carolina Senate. But the motion on the floor is actually to postpone the vote until the next legislative session. They just didn't want to have to take there's just too much controversy. They were hoping they could just kind of kick that can down the road and keep things sort of relatively calm in North Carolina. They just wanted to push it down the road. So that goes through with a vote of 25 to 23. So by 2 votes, they vote to postpone it to the next legislative session. So the next day, August 18th, Tennessee takes a vote, and they do become the 36th state to pass the 19th Amendment. And so with that vote, it is ratified. It was extremely controversial in Tennessee as well. And in the end, of course, the great story is that the representative who ended up casting the deciding vote did it because his mother had sent him a letter telling him to do the right thing and vote for women's suffrage. And so he decided he better listen to his mother. And that is the story, that allowed it to get passed through Tennessee, and they became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. Then there were formalities, that had to happen. And so it wasn't until August 26th that it is officially certified and goes into effect. But August 26, 1920 is the year that it officially goes into effect. So you think, great, wonderful, we won, story's over. Except it's really not, because the issue is very complicated and there's much more to it. We mentioned that in the South, this was a complicated issue, and Sarah's going to tell you a little bit more about the pros and cons, and we'll get into this a little bit more. But, there in the South, there was still a lot of concern about having this Black vote. I mean, there had already been issues with having Black men voting. There was already still a lot of, even though that had, gone into effect with that 15th Amendment years ago, there was still a lot of concern in Southern states about having Black men vote. So now having universal suffrage with women was, added concern, because you've got white women, but you also, again, we have the potential for Black women to be voting as well, which was a concern for many people. So there were many of the same tactics that had been used to keep Black men from voting were put into place, were continued to keep Black women from voting as well. And not just Black women, also, we have these issues with Native American women, really pretty much any women of color where we're facing these issues in North Carolina and other states. So in 1935, Miriam McLeod Bethune founds the National Council of Negro Women, and one of the things that they were pushing for was equal voting rights protection for Black women and really Black men too. But that they do a lot of work and push and push and push, but it's really not until 1965 that we have the Voting Rights Act, the National Voting Rights Act, that outlaws the discriminatory voting practices that had been used, for decades, to keep people of color from voting. So these were the literacy tests, things like that we poll taxes and other intimidation tactics. So that makes a big difference and really expands the right, because finally now there's kind of a way to really enforce that amendment that we hadn't had up until that point, at federal legislation to really enforce that amendment at the state and local level. But it's not even until 1971 that North Carolina actually officially ratifies the 19th Amendment. So, that's very recent in the grand scheme of things, especially when you think about that, this fight goes all the way back to 1848, 1920 you get an amendment, but it's not even until 1971 that, North Carolina finally follows through and ratifies this amendment. Of course, it's a formality at that point because it's, we were already, following and abiding by the 19th Amendment. But it is interesting that it takes that long for it to come back up in a legislative session in North Carolina. And of course, what we also know is happening by the 1970s is this is the beginning of that push again for the Equal Rights Amendment. And so that, is kind of tied up in why, this gets brought forth again and the interest in all of this. So, but that is like a very quick overview. There is way much more complexity that you can get into and so much more detail. But that just gives you kind of some overall context of kind of how it progressed over time. So I'm going to let Sara now talk to you about all the arguments that were being made pro and con over this very long span of time.
Yes, it's been fascinating to look over all of these documents because you look at it and it's very common sense of why women should vote. Going from the entire span of time, beginning from 1848, you have to remember that over the course from then to now, you go through the Civil War, you go through the Industrial Age, and you see changes over time with how women get involved. They, come up with groups who do work for their boys, or their boys are off to war, so now they have to put themselves in those more gender-specific jobs so they can help their boys. And so you slowly start to see the role of women start to change. And so with this grand idea of women actually realizing their self-worth and power, you have some of the reasons why they should be able to vote. And so if you read this document, I mean, it just makes so much common sense. You know, women have been doing this, this, and this. Women are in charge of the home. They're in charge of raising their kids. So why not be in charge of those legislative laws and amendments that will affect the home directly? And I love the spirited mothers make public spirited sons. I mean, they're raising the children. You're raising these men who are, you know, going to go out there and do great things. So why not give their mothers the same rights that they will have? And so you have all of these reasons why women should vote. It's just very common sense, and it's more embracing their sex and embracing the power that women have, that females have, and that they have their own opinions and they have their own rights to do certain things. So why not give them all rights? They are in fact citizens of the US. And so it just makes all the sense that women should contribute to the country that they are already contributing to. You can go to the next one, the why Black women should vote. Again, Edith has told you about the 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. Black people have been declared out of slavery. They're now citizens, and Black men should vote. So if Black men should vote, then there really shouldn't be an issue on race. You already have half of and disenfranchised people being able to vote. So you should extend that to the other half of that disenfranchised people, and you should just allow Black women to vote. It's not that big of a deal. And so Black women, I mean, Black people in general have always had to work twice as hard to get equal rights. And even to this day, obviously, there's still some issues that we're still dealing with. But in this age, Black women, it's really not, we're already citizens, you declared as citizens, we're not enslaved anymore. Congress has already declared that our men should vote, and so we don't see an issue why you shouldn't let women vote. You already, in some areas, have women voting, so we are women. This shouldn't really be that, you know, that big of an equation for you to figure out. And so this pamphlet here just really talks about how women's suffrage isn't a race issue. Black men are already voting, women should vote, women are already voting, so why not just extend it all out? So some of the pro arguments, they are correct, obviously, because women are able to vote now and have made such strides in our own civil rights and equal rights to men. However, you have all of these pro women's suffrage. With that, you have the anti-women's suffrage. And those opinions are fascinating because that is more gender specific and gender role specific. You are taking away, you should stand with your man in his opinion. He's the head of the household, and having an opinion would possibly be for or against his opinion. You don't really want to ruffle any feathers. And Edith, if you go to the next one, you'll see why women should not vote. It's competition with other women, it's competition with men, and there is really no benefit to it. There's a risk that, you know, any good that will happen in the legislation with women included, you know, that's an evil that's coming. And so you have all of these fascinating gender specific, you know, women are too emotional, you know, they'll bring in all this emotion to their voting and it's just going to be too much for them. They'll be hysterical, they'll be against their husband's votes, there will be turmoil in the family, you know, who's going to raise the children. And so it's just really fascinating. If you go to the next one, it's really fascinating. This one I love because it doesn't really focus just on women. It is, you shouldn't have Black people vote, you shouldn't have women vote, because then we'll have to go back to that whole Black people voting thing, and we don't want another Reconstruction where you have all of these Black politicians who are, you know, making laws. They'll affect you. So remember, and this is really focused on men of the South. So the idea of, you know, the men of standing, you have your gentlemen, your, you know, think of like the sugar bakers in Designing Women, you know, the darlings, the women who are taken care of, they're delicate. And so we shouldn't need them to vote, because it will cause all this turmoil. And, you know, we're just bringing up a whole bunch of things that we've already put in the past. Remember the Civil War, remember all the people who have died and who have fought for this country to be the way it is now. So let's not rock the boat. And you have the anti-suffragist groups passing out these pamphlets and basically saying, we don't need any more issues. Things are perfect the way they are. This is how it's always been done. So why are we even thinking about this? And yes, you know, over there across the seas in Britain and in Australia and New Zealand, yeah, they're talking about women's voting, but we're here in America. We have purposefully separated ourselves from all of those countries. So let's focus on us and making us a strong USA. And that includes not having women's opinions. Let's keep them in the home and in those domestic jobs. Have them raise the kids, and you as the head of the household should be the one in charge. Don't let, you know, Northerners take over. Let's keep the South the South. And so you still have the Civil War mentality, Northern aggression, you know, states' rights issue, clouding all of the voting issues. And so what I find fascinating is that on one side, you have you get the 19th Amendment. What happens to those groups? Do they go away, or do they channel their energy into continuing fighting for women's rights? Well, for the anti-suffragists, you have those individuals, well, okay, we lost, we have the right to vote now, yay. And well, they channel all of that energy into anti-feminism. And so you have these groups who are so focused on the power of gender and sex, channeling their energy into a new form. And you have feminism, anti-feminism, and obviously with the fight for women and equal rights and everything, you have the women's movement in the 1970s. And then if you just continue on, you see all of these women, you have the Me Too movement, you have the women's movement, number 2, 3, and 4 to Washington. And so you have even the look of who is getting involved slowly change. And you see what you don't realize, fashion is a big part of all of these movements. And, you know, we are for our rights, but we are going to remind you that we are still women. We're still who we are. We're not going to change. We're just making our votes a little bit more public, our opinions a little bit more public. And then you have the women who are, we just want to stay in the house. You don't need to hear our opinions to change anything. And so you see them butt heads a lot. And, you know, to this day, they're still butting heads. You see it's a lot more, it seems a lot more political now than it does social or even economic, just a bit. Back then it was purely social and political. Now it's a weird mesh of all three. And so looking at these pamphlets, I put the where you can locate some of these pamphlets and more on the bottom so that you can go through and see what kind of things they were actually saying pro and against women's suffrage.
This is a photo that we have that was taken here at High Point. And we don't have the exact date. We can kind of, there's some things about the photo we can use to guess, but this is one of the few documents we have related to women's suffrage activity in High Point, North Carolina here. So we thought we'd take a minute and just let you guys look at this and kind of tell us what are some of the things that you notice when you look at this picture.
Well, first off, the men are in front of the women.
Uh-huh.
And is this a parade?
It does look like a parade. That is our thought.
Yeah, you can barely read the banner. It says votes for women.
Mm-hmm.
So so are the men for,
Yeah, that's a question. And is this a parade just for women's suffrage, you know, like the 1913, you know, parade in DC, or is this part of some other parade, you know, that they're a part of? You know, we can only see this section of it, so it's a little hard to know just by looking at this photo by itself.
So based on the cars, what date do you think these are?
Well, we know this has got to be pretty close to, well, we also know that the equal suffrage, you know, group wasn't even founded until, you know, late here. So this is probably, you know, 1919 maybe. It's hard to know. We don't have a date exactly, but there are some clues here that tell us a little bit more about timing, if you notice. What else do you see that's a clue about the timing?
On the window behind the men, there's an Easter bazaar notice. Right. So that would put it at March, April.
Spring.
Right, in the spring, yeah. So we have that clue. And of course, this is when everything is really heating up in terms of the passage and you know, promotion of passage of that 19th and ratification of that 19th Amendment.
Okay, am I crazy? Am I seeing a horse and buggy there in the back?
Yes, there is some kind of horse and buggy, yep. And we know that here in High Point, of course, we still had those horses and buggies running around for a while still.
Okay.
At that
obviously we see the rail line right down in the middle.
Yes, you can. That's good.
What is missing in this picture?
Say it again.
What is missing in this picture?
Wow. Well, give me some clues.
Well, look at the women in the photo. What else do you notice about the women?
Yeah.
I probably know the answer, but I'll try not to guess.
There's several answers. I mean, it's just whatever you see.
Yeah.
People of color. Women of color.
Yeah, that's missing.
Yeah, so they're all white women.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
You can't really tell how big the group is since it's just a snapshot and there may be more that are obscured behind the car there.
But it doesn't look like an overwhelming number.
No.
No.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it is a truly very small group, how that reflects on if they're married or, if their fathers are prominent people in society, like how that would reflect on them. Because you can see people's face. So, and, High Point's a relatively small town, so they probably know a fair amount of people in the crowd and people would be able to recognize them.
Yeah. So could this
age of the women, do you notice?
Yeah, they seem young.
Yeah.
Could these be the women that, like Miss Kirkman and Shipman? I mean,
yeah, these are most likely, those women that were in that Equal Suffrage Association or league that we had here in High Point. So, and we can't see faces, well enough. It's really hard to really pick out who any of these people are. But you see definitely younger women,
right.
Which would be, these would be the modern progressive women of this time period. These would be, the ones that were getting more education, probably more likely to be, having some kind of work outside the home, even if they were only working until they were married, but they were more likely than previous generations to have that You know, some of these, you could have telephone operators here for all we know, and we don't know exactly what these women were doing, but, and then again, we may have had women who were not working, you know, but who just had the privilege of more time and ability, and as you say, the social cachet to be able to, you know, participate in this kind of activity without any repercussions, you know, that would really negatively impact them. What do you notice about what they're wearing?
Well, it's the white. They're going with the white. Long. And
And not just the color, but what do you notice about the styling of the clothing?
well, it's buttoned up to the neck
Right?
and down to the ground.
Yeah. And it's more traditional in the styling there. You do see women starting to wear more, you know, suit-like outfits that are a little more masculine in this period of time, but these are still very feminine looking dresses. And that was something that at that time, you know, the white was, you know, that kind of universal sign of purity, which kind of signified that, you know, these women were not going to be, these were still the pure, you know, women that you knew that were not being soiled by politics, you know, or anything. And then again, wearing the feminine styling of the clothing is also a signal that, you know, these women aren't necessarily trying to, they're not a threat to men. You know, we're not going to try to take over the men's sphere and push you out of the way. We just want our right to vote. You know, we just want to have our place in the thing here. So that clothing, the styling, and the coloring were significant, you know, and sent signals.
So did we have Easter parades back then?
We're not sure. This could be part of an Easter parade. It's hard to say because we don't know.
Okay. And do you know the source of this photograph?
I'm not sure. I don't think we have a lot of information about where it's a snapshot, and I don't think we have a lot of information about where it came from.
I don't remember having any of that information when I was looking at it earlier.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
The power lines there, I mean, so that sort of dates it to at least, you know, having electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they're phone lines too.
Yeah,
I guess
this is probably, you know, it's probably around 1919 is my guess, because that's when, you know, that the league was formed by then here in High Point. You know, there's all the push, you know, moving towards trying to get support for ratification. At that point, you can see the streetcar line has been laid.
So I'm guessing that's Main Street.
The power lines came in a little bit earlier, so, but they're clearly there, so, yeah.
Yeah, this is Main Street.
Yeah, and the next slide I have actually will show you if you want to know where this is today. You can see this is where that is. That's what it looks like today. So
Okay.
this summer we had participated in the Susan B. Anthony project, and so we took a photo of her where that photo originally was taken. So this gives you a sense of what part of Main Street that is today.
Uh-huh.
So, but it tells us, you know, this photo gives us a sense of kind of, you know, how this activity was happening, you know, here in High Point. And, you know, like I said, this is not, there's a group of women here. There was the activity was present, the sentiment was here, but doesn't appear to be an overwhelming number of women. And the styling, you know, the way that they're dressed, they still are looking, you know, pretty traditional. And that's consistent with what we know about High Point. High Point has always been a fairly conservative community in terms of, you know, with this kind of thing. And we know that here in High Point, we weren't, you know, we've never been particularly, you know, radical in anything. So,
Yeah,
and we also know, you know, the Enterprise didn't give, you know, the newspaper was a fairly conservative newspaper. The Enterprise did not give a lot of attention to the activities of this group. They got these small little notices. We have a couple of notices that just kind of say, you know, they had a meeting. Here's a little bit about what they talked about. it is interesting that they had, one of their meetings, they had a representative from Colorado come out and talk about how the, you know, women's voting was going in Colorado, you know, because they'd had the women's right to vote for a while, and that, you know, everything was fine, and, you know, civilization wasn't crashing down, and it was all
Right.
okay. So, you know, that was part of the campaigning, was to bring these women from other states where it had already happened to kind of, you know, give an update on what was going on, and that make people feel, you know, better about it. But it is fascinating. It's interesting to know that there was, you know, their activity was here, you know, in town.
The documents that Sarah was going over when she was showing those, it said the Raleigh area. Those were in the early 1800s also, I mean 1900s?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I just
And one thing that was happening in North Carolina is that even though, you know, getting that 19, you know, while the push for the 19th Amendment to get ratified was happening here in North Carolina, you know, the legislative bills that we're managing to get through were more focused on, in North Carolina, were more focusing on trying to get just the right to vote in municipal elections. So, I mean, that was still where we were in North Carolina at the point that we're nearing the finish line for getting the 19th Amendment passed, is that you're just having conversations here about, well, maybe it would be okay if women voted in local elections. So, you know, it just shows you that, you know, here in North Carolina, it was very controversial. It was not, and you know, clearly we didn't have enough support to, you know, to make us be the 36th state to go there. But we were still kind of moving in these very, you know, small incremental ways.
Yeah, when I see those documents, my curiosity is the pushback of even trying to get something like that printed, published, distributed, knowing that the industry was, you know, managed by probably the male that was opposed to, you know, it makes me wonder just the backstory of even the you know, the mass communication that was needed for the campaign. And
yeah, I'm sure. I mean, there are those men like Frederick Douglass, who had connections with, you know, probably Black-owned newspapers, who did some of the printing, or who had connections with men who may have owned their own printing press at some point. And, you know, I'm thinking of like Newsies, where you go into the basement of somewhere and there's a printing press, and, you know, they do it in secret. You know, they probably, you know, some of the women probably had husbands who totally fine with their wives and women voting. And so used any resources that they had to promote this, either in secret or outright in public.
Yeah.
And some of the suffrage organizations were also creating their own publications, and because of this, they could not get coverage in, you know, some of these newspapers, these conservative newspapers in different cities and areas around the country. So they actually had their own publications that they were distributing, you know.
And I'm sure the anti-suffragists had a lot more resources than just because, you know, if you're saying, I don't want to vote, and you have a husband who is firmly, I don't want you to vote, and he has resources, then that might be something that actually happened. But it's just interesting to look through all these documents, and you find pamphlets that were specifically geared towards men, pamphlets for these organizations specifically for the women, pamphlets that were just for everyone in general, and how strong, how much conviction you have to have in order to, you know, some of these women
make a change
for this. Some of these women went to insane asylums because and denied food, or said, I'm not going to eat until, and, you know, were treated horribly. And, you know, people don't realize that women's suffrage had just as much issues societally as the civil rights movement. It was just not as well broadcast because you have, radios, you really don't have TVs. And so just the media having to broadcast all of this through newspapers. I mean, it was a little slow, but it was still national news. But in comparison to the civil rights movement, in comparison to the Me Too movement or any movement that's post 1950s, I mean, you have cell phones, you have TV, you have,
we're so connected now. We're too
we're
connected.
so more connected.
Yeah, we're too connected
So
sometimes, but
yeah. But just thinking about how quickly things move now in comparison to back then, I mean, it's just interesting to think about. And with this picture, yes, you notice the lack of people of color. I also notice the lack of children. Now you have all of these organizations and activities that focus on
Right.
children learning the process of voting, how laws are made. You have cartoons and little songs and music, and you have kids being able to participate in their own little elections and getting their own stickers. And you see a lot of children and a lot of parents bringing their kids along with these protests and these walks. And, they may be too little to understand, or they may be too small to make a difference, but they're learning about the process and learning how important it is, and that will stay with them until they're adults and they can actually do something.
Right. Well, I think to appreciate where we are today, you have to go backwards and look at, these rights you just assume have always been there, and you have to know the history to appreciate where we are.
Yeah.
And one other thing about, while there are no women of color in this photo, we know, of course, they were living here in High Point. And we also know that Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who was just nearby over there in Sedalia with her school operating by then, she was already involved in, we know she was involved with, the suffrage movement, and we know that she had connections here in High Point. We know she came back and forth, she spoke at William Penny, she had connections to the community here. So there is reason to believe, that there certainly was some activity in this area, but we just don't know, or at least support, but we don't know much about what it looked like. We haven't found a lot of documentation for what was going on. But just because those women are missing in this photograph doesn't mean that, they weren't here, they weren't supporting that in this community. It just means that this was not really a safe place for them to be doing that at the time.
A productive area for their efforts.
Right, exactly.
So where was the effort? Was it in Raleigh, where more of the women, where was sort of the largest group of women pursuing this in the state? Do you know?
I would say Raleigh, but also Edenton.
What else, Sarah? Where?
Raleigh, but also in Edenton, west of the state. I think there are a lot of different pockets that eventually came together at Raleigh, because you want to go to the capital, that's where things are happening.
Right.
I mean, not in North Carolina, but that's where you make your presence known, at your legislative offices or at the Capitol, to be heard, to be seen.
One thing we know about Clara Cox, who we all know was, we are not surprised to see her as the president of this organization, because she is, is a leader in this community. And because of her family connections, because of her father, she's got political connections all over the place too. So she would have been a big connection, from High Point to some of these other, other organized efforts throughout the state. And we don't have, of course, there's a lot more research. We get more digging into this that we could probably do with her as our thread to kind of see what else we could
Yeah.
figure out. But you know, because of her, you know, this group was likely tied into, you know, the main activities going on around the state, or the main other groups that were happening.
Well, it's very interesting. It is.
Like you said, Van, it's been quite a journey.
Yeah.
You have to look back to see. And so today, when you see the parts of the Voting Rights Act being chipped away at,
Right.
and people don't realize how monumental that is,
Yeah.
without having looked back at all of this history and all of this work and all of the blood, sweat, and tears that went into getting to this point. And you know, it's all political, this being chipped away at. But if this is chipped away at, then you notice, you know, what other civil rights, equal rights things that we haven't even achieved yet, you know, what's being stalled, what's going to be on the chopping block next. And so being aware of what's going on now, I mean, you have to be aware of why we have it and where it started. So you see kind of the enormity of the present.
Right. Yeah.
And I think you have to listen, that sometimes it doesn't even matter sometimes what the intent of some legislation or some kind of thing is, but that perception is important. You know, people are very concerned about the potential for something, even if it was, you know, the intent is this and is very noble. People, you know, who can see, who look at this from the frame of reference of all the struggle that went into this, can see potential for something, even if it's well-intentioned, to be used in a bad way. And so that's where I think, you know, we are having these conversations and thinking about in modern life and thinking about, you know, the potential ramifications and consequences, intended or unintended, of different new policies, new legislation that comes into play around, you know, things like voter ID laws or other things, is that we have to, you know, to really listen to each other and think about where everything's coming from. It's important to understand this context so that we have a better frame of reference for, you know, why people may be reacting to something in a certain way. And then that helps us better listen to each other and have better conversations and try to find the best solutions, you know, to whatever issues we're dealing with today, instead of just kind of these, you know, are just, well, I don't see anything wrong with it. So
Yeah.
it's terrible, you know.
Divisiveness.
Yes, to be able to really hear and really listen, but having that context helps understand why other people are approaching an issue in a certain way, you know.
It helps to understand the fear.
Yes,
Yeah.
you do have to understand the fear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, this is great. This is great. We appreciate you all's expertise and digging in and bringing us from the 1800s to well, where are we? 2020.
Yeah. 100 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. And even, I know it's just sort of crazy, but like I said, you know, your right to vote is very important. So
So go vote if you haven't.
that's right. You get a pin. Yeah. I didn't get my sticker, but I got a pin. So
Yes.
Right, this year it's a pen. That's right.
yeah. Well, thank you, ladies, everybody that participated. We appreciate it. And our next program right now is going to be virtual. And as we get, you know, to the point where we can have these at the lecture hall, we'll give due notice, but we'll always offer a virtual program and record it, and we'll post it on the High Point Museum webpage. Is that right, Teresa?
We'll put it up on our Facebook group. I mean, we'll put it on the High Point Historical Society's Facebook group. We'll
Okay.
put it in the museum Facebook page, and then we'll put it on the Historical Society's website. It's on
Wonderful.
the High Point Museum website.
Right. Great.
So
Wonderful.
there'll be lots of places to see it if people weren't able to tune in today.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And everybody, like we say, go vote and participate. And we will see you in November.